It has by any measure been a horrible day in Perth today. We don't like to talk about the circumstances under which a young man has lost his life as a result of an industrial accident, but that has happened at Curtin University. And according to a report from Lauren Pilot on watoday.com.au, a union organiser who was on the construction site when a roof collapsed at Curtin University, and as well as killing one young worker, it left two others injured, said he had been told safety concerns on the site were rife. Emergency crews were called to the Bentley campus around 12:30 this afternoon after reports of people being trapped by the collapse. A 23-year-old apprentice died at the scene and two men in their 20s have been rushed to Royal Perth Hospital, one of them critically injured after part of the glass ceiling fell on top of them. According to Electrical Trades Union WA branch organiser Damien Clancy, who was on site to visit members when he walked around Building 418, the partially constructed new School of Design and the built environment. He said, "I just heard this almighty crash. I saw steel and glass just showering down." He said he believed there were two men up there when it collapsed and he saw one on the ground. He was moving and screaming, and I thought, OK, he's alive. It's a pretty harrowing story, but the question that we ask ourselves is why? And Steve Chandler, to whom we're just about to have a conversation, he's a property development expert, and he also has a union background in his past. He tweeted, Steve, do you mind me asking you what you tweeted?
I basically said that no one should ever lose their life when they go to work.
Absolutely not. I suppose the big question, and look, in this particular instance and in every instance where you have nasty accidents like this, the question is always asked, how did it happen? From your perspective, especially now you're involved in property development and obviously the results of what you develop, people live in, people work in, people have to conduct their day-to-day existence in. How do you ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen?
That's a really good question, Chris. And what we do is we rely on other people to do their jobs properly. It's whenever this happens, you've got to look at it and you go, something has obviously gone wrong. Something catastrophic has gone wrong, and only the authorities are going to be able to, work through that when they do their investigation. And I'm sure WorkSafe WA, will find out in the end what has actually happened. But look, what we do is we rely on our architects, our structural engineers, our civil engineers. All the people who do the design work for these projects to design, safely. Australian standards and our different structural codes, etc. They're some of the best in the world.
Can I put it to you though? And I always look at this, and I've seen it time and time and again. And it's one of these things where I'm not a betting man, but I'm always willing to have a wager on this. Whenever you see the circumstance where something goes awry, something doesn't meet specifications or something otherwise goes wrong, I always say look for the penny pinching. And we seem to live in a world where regardless of anything else, lots of work is done by the person who's been quickest to race to the bottom when it comes to tendering for a job. And it seems to me in a myriad of different areas, nobody turns around and asks the obvious question. Okay, in this case, Steve, how on earth are you going to do the job for that money and still make a profit and remain viable? If we were simply to ask that question in many occasions, I suspect we would come to the conclusion that certain people and certain organisations were not fit to do the job based on what they'd tendered, or we would then see some people say, well, I've got to withdraw my tender. And then again, we might look at somebody else and say, well, okay, this is a higher tender, but they've met all the minimum specifications and we can see that they haven't tried to cut any corners. And this seems to me to be the biggest problem. For example, on this site, and I'm not necessarily making a connection between the two here, there is a claim in the article, and it says, and I quote from the article, other guys did all the wiring and the structure before they put the glass in, and again, accidents are accidents, but nobody's got a crystal ball. But it seems to me that the builder was well aware of an issue to the point where they brought a surveyor out here last week to determine the levels of sag in the steel after they put about half of the glass up. That should have been ringing alarm bells, shouldn't it?
Oh, Yes, absolutely. I suppose for your listeners, we might just sort of mention that if they haven't seen the articles, that this is a glass roof sitting on top of a structural steel frame. And what they're talking about there is that when they built the steel frame, then they started putting the glass on, and they noticed a sag that was potentially more than what it should have been. So obviously the builders have got their surveyor to come out to have a look to see what the sag is given the load. The engineers would have looked at those results, and somebody would have said, yep, okay, it's okay to proceed. That's the big question mark now, is like who said it was safe to proceed and on what basis? And was it just on the basis of a survey, or did an engineer actually go and have a climb around the roof structure and have a look at the connections where things were connected to the main part of the building, or was there some bolts missing, or who knows? This is the thing.
Obviously the investigation's going to determine this, but wouldn't a sag in and of itself, and once again we're just quoting from the report, I'm not necessarily suggesting there was anything awry, but if the sag was there and only half the glass was up, logically, wouldn't that be ringing alarm bells in someone's head? Wouldn't there be an architect, a structural engineer or somebody like that who'd be going, hang on a second, there's a problem here?
Without sounding like I'm defending the builder, no. And the reason for that is every steel structure, even a concrete structure, will sag under a load. And it's designed to take the load and to actually deflect. So bridges over rivers, all this sort of stuff, when you put a load on it, it will always sag. So it's an expectation that you're going to get some sort of what we call a deflection under the load. It's just a question of how much, or maybe they loaded the glass, from one side going, across to the centre, when maybe they should have been putting a bit of glass on the left-hand side and then a bit on the right-hand side.
But when you talk about sagging and all that sort of stuff, when we talk about this, isn't it logically set down? For example, those who are experts in the field would know what is and what isn't acceptable, I would imagine, and also the way certain things are installed and how they're installed. Once again, would that not be laid down by people who are supposedly experts in the field? Once again, Definitely. You have to ask the question, don't you? How do things like this happen? And more importantly, what sort of supervision takes place? Was there somebody, or should there have been somebody, for example, whose responsibility it was to take an overview of the site? They might look at circumstances and say, right, I'm not happy right now. Let's stop. We need to take another look at this.
Definitely. Yeah, look, safety is everybody's obligation. Some people would be privy to the information on what was checked and whether or not that was safe. Someone would have said it's okay to keep going, knowing what's happened. Someone, for sure. And that person giving that approval would have then triggered everyone else to continue on, with what they were doing, and which has obviously then subsequently resulted in what's happened today.
Are we learning anything from these accidents? Unfortunately, we human beings tend to be subscribers to tombstone engineering, which is no comfort to those people who lose loved ones. Why is it that we can't look at this sort of stuff, bearing in mind the technology we have, what we've learnt over the years, and prevent these sort of things from happening? I still find myself, it nags me in the back of my brain, I have to say. Steve, I still believe that part of our problem is that we are in the era of penny pinching. Everybody's looking to save a buck somewhere. And I always say, and I still maintain, if you're ever looking for the problem, and certainly if I was a person charged with investigating a myriad of incidents like this and others, the first thing I would be looking for is the penny pinching. I'd be saying, who cut corners and where? Because that just seems to be the era in which we live. Are we ever going to find a road out of that? I mean, I get back to the old analogy, you know what they used to say, and I don't even know if this is true, but I get the point, that the one thing the astronaut thinks of when taking off in the NASA spacecraft is that every single part was supplied by the company who put in the lowest tender. Now, I would imagine that taking that from its extreme, you would imagine the average astronaut feels a bit uneasy when the whole thing is taking off. Is that part of a problem industrially in a myriad of different areas, that we're too busy focusing on what we can deliver? And we often use buzzwords like efficiency. And I've often seen efficiency for, we're going to slash and burn to the greatest extent we can to save a dollar. Is that really a sensible way to go? And potentially, and I'm not suggesting that is the case in this instance, but potentially, are people paying for this with their lives?
I think potentially the answer is yes, Chris. You know, I do believe the potential is there. Look, builders don't have huge margins. I don't care what people say. I've been in the industry for 40 years. I know that builders don't have big margins. I know that when we tender a project that, you know, I've got to throw away the bottom price because they're the ones who've made the most mistakes, and they're the ones who will effectively want to cut corners, putting, you know, me and other people at risk. So we know not to, you know, go with that cheapest quote, but sometimes with the builders, with the margins that they're pushed to try and win a project, even if they win it from second place, they still may have made mistakes. And when you've got a very small margin, that generates exactly what you're talking there, where it's like, oh, we've got to find the contractor who can do it for the right price, as opposed to doing it, you know, exactly how we want. They look for alternate products and alternate ways of doing things.
Well, we saw that. We saw that with the Perth Children's Hospital when we had asbestos-laden products there. And that was explained to me very simply, that somebody said, I want a cheaper price. I want to get this cheaper, and the supplier said, no worries, we can do that. And what happened was they got supplied with a product that was in fact illegal. And because they imported the product, nobody bothered to ask the question. I dare say nobody cared to ask the question, what's in this stuff, and how are you able to supply it for the price you're supplying it?
Steve, you just opened another door there too, Chris.
Yeah, I know.
Imported product.
I know. Steve, we're out of time now, but thank you very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Steve Chandler's a property development expert. And one thing I can almost guarantee, that at some point, whenever you're looking for a problem with something, just sniff around and see where the penny pinching started.